The small town of Pinewood hadn't seen rain in weeks, but on the morning Mr. Reynolds arrived at Valley Funeral Home, the skies opened up. Hank, who had been a funeral director for just over 20 years, always found it strange how the weather seemed to match the mood of his work. He stood at the window of his office, watching fat raindrops splatter against the glass while thunder rumbled in the distance. The phone call had come in around 5 a.m., Mrs. Reynolds reporting that her husband had passed peacefully in his sleep. At 78, with a history of heart problems, no one questioned it. The doctor signed the death certificate without hesitation. Natural causes. Now, as Hank prepared the body for the wake scheduled in 3 days, something didn't feel right. He'd handled thousands of bodies over his career, and certain things you just come to know. Certain signs you recognize without even realizing you're looking for them. Mr. Reynolds lay on the preparation table under the harsh fluorescent lights. Hank moved methodically, with the respect he gave to all those who came through his doors. But as he turned the body to begin the embalming process, he noticed something odd, bruising around the neck that didn't match with someone who died peacefully in their sleep. Hank frowned, leaning closer. The discoloration was subtle, easily missed if you weren't paying attention. He'd seen similar marks before, though, on a drowning victim 5 years back. But Mr. Reynolds hadn't drowned. He'd died in his bed, according to his wife. "What happened to you?" Hank whispered, though he knew there would be no answer. He continued his work, but the unsettling feeling grew as he discovered more inconsistencies. The positioning of other bruises on the upper arms suggested someone had gripped him tightly. There was also slight damage to the fingernails that looked like defensive wounds, the kind people get when they're fighting back against something. Or someone. Hank completed the preparation process, his mind racing. Should he call the police? But what would he say? That his gut feeling told him something was wrong? That after 20 years of preparing bodies, he could tell the difference between a natural death and something else? They'd laugh him out of town. Besides, the death certificate was already signed. Case closed. By the time he locked up that evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the world with that fresh-washed smell. Hank breathed it in deeply as he walked to his car, trying to clear his head. Perhaps he was overthinking things. Perhaps the marks had innocent explanations. The next morning, Hank arrived early to finish up with Mr. Reynolds. The funeral home was quiet, peaceful even, with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of the viewing room. He flipped on the lights in the preparation area and froze. Something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but then he realized the body had been moved. Not dramatically, but enough that someone who paid attention to details would notice. The sheet was folded differently than how he'd left it. Hank looked around the room. Everything else seemed untouched. The lock on the back door showed no signs of tampering. The alarm system hadn't been triggered. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish immediately. He was alone in the building, or at least alone with the dead. He approached Mr. Reynolds cautiously. Nothing seemed altered with the body itself, just its positioning. Hank shook his head, wondering if he was losing his mind. Maybe he was just tired and had forgotten exactly how he'd left things. The rest of the day passed without incident. Hank met with the Reynolds family to discuss final arrangements. Mrs. Reynolds was a tiny woman with silver hair and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Their daughter sat beside her, arm protectively around her mother's shoulders. "He was a good man," Mrs. Reynolds said, dabbing at her eyes. "We had our troubles like anyone, but 52 years of marriage. You learn to work through things." "I'm very sorry for your loss," Hank said, the words practiced but sincere. The daughter, Beth, she'd introduced herself as, watched him with sharp eyes. "Mom said Dad looked peaceful." "That you did a good job," Hank nodded. "I try to make everyone look their best. Give families their last good memory." "Were there any issues?" Beth asked, something unreadable in her expression. Hank hesitated. "Issues? With preparing him, any unexpected problems?" Mrs. Reynolds patted her daughter's hand. "Beth, please, Mr. Miller doesn't need to get into all that." Hank studied Beth's face. Was she fishing for information? Did she suspect something too? "Everything went as expected," Hank said carefully. "Your father is ready for the viewing tomorrow." Beth held his gaze for a moment longer than comfortable, then looked away. "Thank you." After they left, Hank couldn't shake the strange interaction. He pulled Mr. Reynolds' personal effects from the safe, a wedding ring, watch, wallet, and a small notebook that had been in his pajama pocket. He hesitated, then opened the notebook. Most of it contained what looked like daily reflections, notes about the weather, brief mentions of visitors. Nothing unusual. But the last entry, dated the day before his death, sent a chill down Hank's spine. She was in the room again last night, standing at the foot of the bed. I pretended to be asleep. Don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Hank closed the notebook, his heart pounding. This wasn't his business. He had no right reading a dead man's private thoughts. And yet, that night, long after he should have gone home, Hank sat in his office researching Mr. Reynolds. Public records showed nothing suspicious. Retired school principal, active in the local historical society, no criminal record. By all accounts, a respectable member of the community. He was about to shut down his computer when the phone rang. Hank jumped, not expecting calls this late. He picked up hesitantly. Valley Funeral Home, silence. Hello? Can I help you? More silence, but Hank could hear something. Faint breathing on the other end. Who is this? The breathing continued, slow and deliberate. Then just as Hank was about to hang up, a whisper. Check the cellar. The line went dead. Hank stared at the phone. The Reynolds didn't have a cellar. They lived in one of those newer ranch-style homes on the edge of town. The funeral home didn't have one either. It was built on a concrete slab. His cell phone buzzed with a text message, making him jump again. It was from a number he didn't recognize. Not their cellar. His. Hank's mouth went dry. He locked up the funeral home in record time, checking twice that all doors and windows were secure. The drive home seemed longer than usual, shadows stretching across the road and the headlights of his car. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When his alarm went off the next morning, Hank felt like he'd barely closed his eyes. The viewing was scheduled for that afternoon, which meant he needed to be at his best, professional, compassionate, invisible when needed and present when required. As he arrived at work, he noticed a police car parked outside. His heart skipped a beat. Inside, Officer Patel was waiting. Sorry to bother you so early, she said, but we got an anonymous tip I need to follow up on. Hank tried to keep his expression neutral. What kind of tip? Someone suggested we might want to take a closer look at Howard Reynolds' death. Said the funeral director had concerns. Hank felt cold all over. I never called anything in. Officer Patel raised an eyebrow. So you don't have concerns? Hank hesitated. I noticed some unusual bruising, and his personal effects included a notebook with a strange final entry. But I didn't call anyone. Mind if I take a look? 20 minutes later, after examining both the body and the notebook, Officer Patel was on her radio calling for backup. We're going to need to postpone the viewing, she told Hank, and I'll need a statement from you. Word spread quickly through town. By afternoon, everyone knew the police were investigating Howard Reynolds' death as suspicious. Mrs. Reynolds was being questioned. Their home was being searched. And then came the news that broke the case wide open. Underneath a false floor in Howard's workshop, the police found a second notebook, this one documenting years of abuse Mrs. Reynolds had suffered. The final entry described his plan to confront her about something he'd discovered. Hank watched the story unfold from a distance, providing information when asked, but otherwise staying out of the spotlight. The autopsy confirmed what his trained eye had noticed. Howard Reynolds had been suffocated. 3 days after the investigation began, Hank received another late-night phone call at the funeral home. You noticed what everyone else missed, said a man's voice. Unfamiliar, rough with age or emotion. Thank you. Who is this? Hank asked. A friend of Howard's. He told me if anything happened to him to look into it. I knew I couldn't go to the police without evidence, so I went to the next best person, the one who would see him last. You sent me that text about the cellar. Howard always hid important things there. I hoped you'd find a way to bring it to light. Before Hank could ask anything else. The caller hung up. That night, as Hank finally prepared to close the funeral home, he stood for a moment in the empty viewing room. His job had always been about providing closure, helping families say goodbye with dignity. He never expected to help provide justice. In the quiet room, he could almost imagine Howard Reynolds nodding in approval. Some stories didn't end when the heart stopped beating. Some truths refused to stay buried. Hank turned off the lights and locked the door behind him. Tomorrow would bring new families, new stories, and now he knew to look more closely, to listen to the silent witnesses that passed through his care. Some secrets, he had learned, followed you to the grave. Others found a way to escape. The wind howled through the cracks of the old Victorian funeral home as Eleanor locked up for the night. Seabreeze funeral services had stood on this rocky New England coastline for over a century, weathering countless nor'easters and the changing times. Eleanor had taken over the business 5 years ago when her uncle retired, becoming the fourth generation of her family to guide the local community through their darkest hours. Tonight, she moved through the familiar hallways with a sense of unease she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the approaching storm that had the whole town boarding up windows. Or perhaps it was the unusual client who had arrived that afternoon. The body of Gilbert Walsh had been delivered just before closing. A local artist known for his strange, haunting paintings of the sea, Gilbert had lived alone in a lighthouse keeper's cottage for the past 30 years. He had no family that anyone knew of, but his lawyer had appeared promptly with very specific funeral instructions. Mr. Walsh was particular, the lawyer had explained, handing over a sealed envelope along with the standard paperwork. These are his exact wishes for his funeral arrangements. He was quite insistent they be followed to the letter. Now alone in the preparation room, Eleanor opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of handwritten instructions. Her eyebrows rose higher with each paragraph. Gilbert wanted to be dressed in clothes he had provided, an antique sailor's uniform that looked at least a century old. 7 specific objects were to be placed in the casket with him, including a tarnished compass, a small glass bottle filled with sand, and an oddly carved piece of driftwood. The casket was to remain open during the service, which was to be held at exactly midnight, 3 days after his death, regardless of weather conditions. Most strange of all, a sealed letter was to be placed on his chest, but only after all other preparations were complete. This letter, marked with a wax seal bearing the image of a kraken, was only to be opened and read aloud at the end of the service. "Well, Mr. Walsh," Eleanor murmured to the sheet-covered form on the preparation table, "you certainly planned an exit as eccentric as your life." She began the standard preparations, working methodically as she'd been trained. The radio played softly in the background, a habit that helped fill the silence during these solitary night sessions. As she worked, the signal began to fade in and out, static interrupting the late-night talk show. Eleanor frowned and glanced at the radio. The interference grew worse until only crackling static remained. "Perfect," she sighed. "Just what I need during a storm." She reached to turn it off when suddenly, through the static, she heard what sounded like a voice. Not the radio host, but something different, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over the dial as she strained to hear. "Returning tide. Coming in." The voice faded back into static. Eleanor quickly switched off the radio, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Just interference from the storm, she told herself. Nothing more. She returned to her work, but couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the room. The air felt heavier somehow, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed, though they were a good half-mile from the shore. As she turned to reach for an instrument, she noticed something that made her breath catch. The bottle of sand that was supposed to go in Gilbert's casket. She'd placed it on the counter across the room, was now sitting right beside her instruments, though she had no memory of moving it. "I must be more tired than I thought," she whispered, picking up the bottle. The sand inside seemed to shift on its own, not settling like normal sand should. Eleanor set it down quickly. She completed the basic preparations and decided to finish the rest tomorrow. The storm was picking up outside, and she wanted to get home before the roads flooded. As she covered Gilbert's body with a sheet, she could have sworn she saw his eyelids flutter. Eleanor stepped back quickly, heart pounding. No, impossible. Just a trick of the light and her tired mind. That night, Eleanor dreamed of the sea. In her dream, she stood on a rocky shore as waves crashed against the cliffs. A figure stood in the distance looking out at the water. As she approached, she recognized Gilbert Walsh, though she had only seen him dead. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the churning sea. "It returns with the tide," he said, his voice somehow audible over the crashing waves. "Always with the tide." Eleanor woke with a start to the sound of rain hammering against her bedroom window. The digital clock beside her bed read 3:17 a.m. As she sat up, disoriented, she noticed water on the floor, a puddle seeping in from under her bedroom door. Groaning, she got up to check for leaks, but when she opened the door, there was no water in the hallway. Confused, she turned back to look at her bedroom floor. The puddle was gone. The floor was completely dry. Eleanor barely slept the rest of the night. By morning, she'd convinced herself it had all been part of her dream. The voice on the radio, the moving bottle, the water on her floor. She'd been working too hard lately, that was all. She arrived at the funeral home early, determined to finish Gilbert's preparations and put her uneasiness behind her. The building was quiet except for the persistent patter of rain on the roof. Eleanor hung her wet coat in the office and headed to the preparation room. The sheet covering Gilbert's body had been removed and folded neatly on a nearby chair. Eleanor stopped in the doorway, suddenly cold despite the building's warmth. She was certain she'd covered him before leaving last night. Had someone else come in early? But she was the only one with keys besides the cleaning service, and they never entered the preparation room. She approached the body cautiously. Gilbert lay exactly as she'd left him, half prepared for his final viewing. Nothing else seemed disturbed. With shaking hands, Eleanor reached for a fresh sheet, determined to get through this bizarre day. As she worked, she thought she heard whispering, so faint she couldn't be sure it wasn't just the wind. But it grew more distinct as the morning wore on, always just at the edge of hearing. Words in a language she didn't recognize, spoken in multiple voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The small objects that were to go into the casket with Gilbert kept moving. Eleanor would place the compass on the counter and turn to find it on the floor. The bottle of sand appeared in different places throughout the room. Once she could have sworn she saw the carved piece of driftwood twitch like something alive. By midday, Eleanor was seriously considering calling in another funeral director to take over. But her family's reputation was built on reliability and discretion. She couldn't admit she was being spooked by what must be her own exhaustion and imagination. She decided to take a break for lunch, locking the preparation room door behind her. In her office, she researched Gilbert Walsh online, hoping to make sense of his strange funeral requests. She found articles about his art, disturbing seascapes that critics had described as windows into another world, and about his reclusive lifestyle. One article mentioned rumors that he practiced old ways and sea magic, though the writer dismissed these as local superstition. A small news item from 20 years ago caught her attention. Apparently, Gilbert had been the sole survivor of a fishing boat that had gone down in a sudden storm. All 6 other crew members had been lost. Gilbert had been found clinging to a piece of driftwood, delirious and repeating the same phrase over and over. "It comes with the tide." Eleanor felt a chill. The same words from her dream. When she returned to the preparation room, the sailor's uniform she was supposed to dress Gilbert in had been laid out neatly beside the body, though she'd left it in its box. The 7 objects were arranged in a circle on Gilbert's chest. Eleanor backed toward the door, her hand fumbling for the knob. This was too much. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice. Clear as day, not a whisper this time. "You must complete it." She turned slowly. Gilbert's body hadn't moved, but the air above him seemed to shimmer slightly like heat rising from hot pavement. "The ritual must be completed by the appointed hour," the voice continued. It didn't seem to come from the body, but from all around her. "Or they will come for more than just me." Eleanor gripped the doorframe for support. Who will come?" "Those who dwell in the deep. Those I made a bargain with long ago." She should run, Eleanor thought. Call someone, anyone. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. And yet, she was a professional. She had a duty, and something told her that walking away now would be far more dangerous than seeing this through. "What do I need to do?" she asked, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "Follow my instructions. Prepare me as written. Read the letter when the time comes. Complete the circle." The shimmering air faded. The room felt suddenly normal again, though the objects remained arranged on Gilbert's chest. For the next 2 days, Eleanor worked mechanically, following Gilbert's instructions to the letter. The strange occurrences continued. Whispers, moving objects, the persistent smell of the sea. But she forced herself to continue. She told no one what was happening. Who would believe her? The night of the funeral arrived with the biggest storm of the season. Eleanor expected no one would come given the weather, but to her surprise, a dozen strangers appeared at the funeral home just before midnight. They were an odd assortment: weathered fishermen, elegant older women, a few younger people with artists' hands. None introduced themselves, and all declined to sign the guest book. The service proceeded according to Gilbert's instructions. At the stroke of midnight, Eleanor found herself standing beside the open casket, breaking the seal on the mysterious letter with trembling fingers. The storm outside reached a crescendo as she began to read the spidery handwriting aloud. To those who gather here, I leave my gratitude and my warning. 30 years ago I struck a bargain with the old ones of the deep. In exchange for inspiration and long life, I promised to return to them at my death, bringing 7 souls with me. Eleanor's voice faltered as she looked up at the 12 strangers, their faces eerily calm. But I have found another way, she continued reading. The 7 objects I take with me are soul vessels, freely given by 7 who would have come before. With these tokens and the proper words, I break my debt without further cost. The building shook with a thunderous boom that Eleanor knew wasn't thunder. The strangers began to chant in unison, words that matched the whispering she'd been hearing for days. The bargain is broken, she read, the final words on the page. The tide recedes. Remember me kindly. As she spoke the last word, the storm outside suddenly stopped. The absolute silence that followed was almost as frightening as the chaos before it. One by one, the strangers filed past the casket, each touching one of the objects arranged there, then left without a word. Eleanor closed the funeral home alone that night. Her understanding of the world forever changed. In the preparation room, she noticed a small package on her desk that hadn't been there before. Inside was a piece of driftwood, carved into the shape of a protective charm with a note, "For the one who helped me keep my final promise. May it shield you from what dwells below." She wore it around her neck from that day forward, a reminder that death was not always the end of the story, and that some requests, no matter how strange, were best fulfilled exactly as asked. The bell above the door of Washington Family Funeral Home chimed softly as the last mourners filed out. Roy and Diane Washington stood side by side in the entryway, accepting condolences with practiced grace. Their funeral home had served the community of Millfield for 4 generations, passing from father to son, then to Roy and his wife Diane when Roy's sister chose a different path. "Thank you for everything," said the widow of Harold Fletcher, clutching Roy's hand. Harold would have approved. Roy nodded solemnly. Harold Fletcher had been Millfield's most successful businessman, owning half the commercial real estate downtown and holding investments across 3 counties. His funeral had drawn nearly the entire town, filling the viewing room with flowers and hushed conversations about who might take over his various enterprises. "If you need anything at all," Diane added, her voice gentle but professional, "please don't hesitate to call us." When the last car pulled away from the curb, Roy locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. He loosened his tie with a sigh of relief. "That's the biggest service we've had all year," he said, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. "I thought the mayor was going to talk until midnight." Diane smiled wearily. "Well, Fletcher practically owned this town. Did you see how many people from the bank showed up? And that fancy lawyer from the city?" They moved through the funeral home, turning off lights and checking rooms, a nightly ritual performed hundreds of times over their 20 years running the business together. When they reached the office, Roy paused. "Someone's been in here," he said quietly. Diane looked past him at the office. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but Roy had an eye for detail. He pointed to the desk drawer, pulled out just slightly further than he always left it. "Maybe one of the part-timers needed something," Diane suggested. Roy shook his head. "They know better than to go through my desk." He approached cautiously, pulling the drawer open fully. Nothing seemed to be missing, just the usual pens, paper clips, and business cards. As they finished locking up and headed to their apartment above the funeral home, Diane couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It wasn't like Roy to be paranoid. If he said someone had been in the office, someone had been. The next morning brought a surprise visitor before official opening hours. Roy was reviewing paperwork when the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was a young woman in her 30s, her red hair pulled back in a neat bun, her posture stiff with obvious discomfort. "We're not actually open yet," Roy began, but the woman cut him off. "I'm Vivian Fletcher, Harold's daughter." Roy blinked in surprise. In all the arrangements for Harold Fletcher's funeral, no daughter had been mentioned. His wife had handled everything, stating clearly that her husband had no living relatives besides herself. "Please come in," Roy said, recovering quickly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Vivian Fletcher's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Are you?" "I wouldn't know. I haven't seen my father in 15 years. She followed Roy to the consultation room where Diane joined them, bringing coffee. Vivian took the cup but didn't drink, instead turning it slowly in her hands. "Mrs. Fletcher, your stepmother, didn't mention you during the arrangements," Diane said carefully. "She wouldn't. She's pretended I don't exist since I was 17. Vivian looked up, her green eyes hard. "Did you find anything unusual among my father's personal effects?" Roy and Diane exchanged a glance. "Everything was returned to your stepmother," Roy answered. "What are you looking for?" Vivian set her untouched coffee on the table. "My father kept notebooks. For years. They're bound in black leather with the date embossed on the spine." "We didn't see anything like that," Diane said. "Just his wallet, watch, wedding ring. The standard items. He would have had one with him. He always did." Vivian leaned forward. "My father had a strange hobby, Mr. and Mrs. Washington. He collected obituaries. Thousands of them going back decades." Roy raised his eyebrows. "That's not so unusual in our line of work. Many people develop an interest in—" "He didn't just collect them," Vivian interrupted. "He predicted them." Silence fell in the consultation room. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past, the everyday sound jarring against the tension inside. "What do you mean, predicted?" Diane finally asked. Vivian rubbed her temples. "It sounds crazy, I know. When I was a kid, I thought it was just a weird game he played. He'd clip obituaries from newspapers, but he'd have the person's name written down in his notebook before they died. Sometimes weeks before, sometimes just days." Roy shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps he knew these people were ill." "That's what I thought too at first. But it wasn't just the elderly or the sick. It was accidents, unexpected heart attacks. Even," she hesitated, "murders." "Ms. Fletcher," Diane said gently, "grief can sometimes make us see patterns that—" "I'm not grief-stricken," Vivian snapped. "I made my peace with my father years ago. But I need those notebooks. When I left home, he had already filled 26 of them. God knows how many more he completed before he died." "Why are they so important to you now?" Roy asked. Vivian stood abruptly. "Because the last time I saw one, it had my name in it. And yours." After Vivian left, Roy and Diane sat in stunned silence. "She's troubled," Diane finally said. "Estranged from her family, probably has unresolved issues with her father." Roy nodded, but his mind was on the desk drawer that had been disturbed the night before. "Maybe, but someone was definitely in our office yesterday." "You don't think—" Diane began, then shook her head. "No, that's ridiculous." But they both knew what she wasn't saying. What if Vivian was telling the truth? That afternoon, Roy called Harold Fletcher's widow about some overlooked paperwork, a transparent excuse to visit the Fletcher home. Mrs. Fletcher, a polished woman in her 50s, invited him in reluctantly. "I thought everything was settled," she said, leading him to a sitting room decorated in shades of cream and beige. "The service was lovely. I've already sent your check." "Just a few final details," Roy assured her. "By the way, I understand Mr. Fletcher had a daughter from a previous relationship?" Mrs. Fletcher's smile froze. "Who told you that?" "She came by the funeral home this morning. Vivian, I believe her name was." Mrs. Fletcher's hand fluttered to her pearls. "Harold's past indiscretions are hardly relevant now. If that woman contacted you, I suggest you ignore her. She's unstable." Roy smiled diplomatically. "Of course. Also, Mrs. Fletcher, did your husband by any chance keep journals? Black leather-bound books?" The change in Mrs. Fletcher's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her face paled and she stood up sharply. "I think you should leave now, Mr. Washington. Any personal effects of my husband's are none of your concern." As Roy was all but pushed out the door, he noticed a small study off the main hallway. Through the partially open door, he glimpsed a bookshelf with a row of identical black spines. Back at the funeral home, Roy found Diane in the embalming room, preparing for their next client. "I think Vivian Fletcher was telling the truth," he said without preamble. "Her stepmother nearly threw me out when I mentioned the notebooks, but I saw them, at least a dozen on a shelf in his study." Diane set down her instruments. "That doesn't mean they contain predictions of deaths, Roy. That's a huge leap." "I know, but—" Roy was interrupted by the phone. Diane peeled off her gloves to answer it. Washington Family Funeral Home. Yes, he's here. She held out the phone to Roy, mouthing Fletcher's lawyer. The conversation was brief. The lawyer, speaking in clipped formal tones, explained that he had been instructed to deliver a package to Roy Washington in the event of Harold Fletcher's death. He would be stopping by within the hour. True to his word, the lawyer arrived 50 minutes later, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Roy with a business card. Mr. Fletcher was very specific that this be given directly to you, not your wife or any employee. I've fulfilled my obligation. Good day. As the door closed behind the lawyer, Roy and Diane stared at the package. Are you going to open it? Diane asked. Roy nodded slowly, carefully unwrapping the paper. Inside was a black leather notebook, identical to those he'd glimpsed in Fletcher's study. The year embossed on the spine was next year's date. With trembling fingers, Roy opened the cover. On the first page, in neat handwriting, was a message. To Roy Washington. You don't know me, but I've known about you for some time. Inside this book are names and dates. I've been collecting them for 40 years. They always come true. I don't control it. I just record what I see. This is the last book. Your name is in here, as is your wife's. I'm sorry. Roy turned the page. The book was filled with names and dates, organized chronologically. Some had additional notes. Heart failure, a car accident, stroke. This is insane, Diane whispered, reading over his shoulder. We need to call the police. And tell them what? That a dead man left us a book of supposed future deaths? Roy shook his head. They'd think we were crazy. They paged through the notebook together, recognizing names of local residents. The first date listed was just 3 days away. A 90-year-old man at the nursing home with natural causes written beside his name. We'll wait, Roy decided. If this first prediction comes true, then we'll figure out what to do next. 3 days later, they received a call from the nursing home asking them to collect the body of the exact man listed in Fletcher's notebook. He had passed peacefully in his sleep. It could be a coincidence, Diane insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. He was elderly, in poor health. The second name in the book died a week later, a middle-aged woman who choked while dining alone. Then a teenager in a skateboarding accident. Each death exactly as predicted. Roy became obsessed with the notebook, checking it daily, trying to find patterns or explanations. They debated whether to warn the people listed, but how could they explain how they knew? Who would believe them? One night, as Roy pored over the book in their living room, Diane brought him a cup of tea. Have you looked at our dates? She asked quietly. Roy closed the book quickly. No, and I don't want to. Don't you think we should know? What good would it do? Roy asked. If these predictions are real, they're going to happen regardless. I don't want to spend whatever time we have left counting down the days. Diane sat beside him, taking his hand. What about Vivian Fletcher? Should we tell her about the book? Roy considered this. Maybe. She deserves to know what her father was doing. And maybe she understands more about this than we do. The next day, they called the number Vivian had left, but it was disconnected. A visit to her hotel revealed she had checked out the day after meeting with them. That night, Roy woke suddenly at 3 a.m., certain he'd heard something downstairs in the funeral home. Diane was fast asleep beside him. He grabbed his robe and the flashlight they kept by the bed. The funeral home was dark and quiet as Roy descended the stairs. He moved through the viewing rooms, checking doors and windows. Everything seemed secure, but when he reached the office, he knew someone had been there. The desk drawer was fully open, papers scattered across the floor. Fletcher's notebook was gone. In its place was a different black leather book, much older, the leather cracked with age. A note was paperclipped to the cover. I'm sorry for taking the new book, but I needed to know my date. This is his first book. It explains everything. Don't try to find me, and whatever you do, don't try to change the dates. It only makes things worse. VF Roy opened the ancient notebook with shaking hands. On the first page was a journal entry dated nearly 40 years earlier, written in the same neat handwriting as the newer book. Today I saw my first death date. I don't know how or why this is happening to me. I tried to save her, a little girl who was going to drown. I pulled her from the lake before she could go under, but she died anyway. Allergic reaction to something at the picnic. Same time, same day I foresaw. I tried 3 more times with 3 more people. Different methods, same results. Death will not be cheated. I can only record what I see and pray for forgiveness. Roy closed the book, suddenly understanding the burden Harold Fletcher had carried, and the burden he'd now passed to them. He climbed the stairs slowly, the old notebook tucked under his arm, wondering how to tell Diane that some secrets weren't meant to be discovered. And some books weren't meant to be read. 200 miles away from Millfield, Hank sat in his small apartment kitchen, staring at his laptop screen. For weeks now, he'd been researching similar cases to Mr. Reynolds, deaths ruled as natural that showed subtle signs of something else. It had become something of an obsession since that night at the funeral home, when the anonymous caller had thanked him. He took a sip of cold coffee and scrolled through another news article. This one was from a town called Lakeside, about an elderly man found dead in his bed. Nothing unusual there, but what caught Hank's attention was a small detail mentioned in passing. The man had been a prominent businessman with a collection of obituaries dating back decades. Hank sat up straighter. Something about that detail nagged at him. He'd read something similar recently, though he couldn't remember where. He began searching through his browser history, trying to find the connection. An hour later, he had compiled a list of 5 deaths across 3 states, all with odd similarities. Each person had died in ways that initially seemed natural but raised questions upon closer inspection, and each had some connection to death records or obituaries. 2 had been medical examiners, one a cemetery caretaker, another a historical researcher specializing in death records, and now this businessman with his obituary collection. What's the connection? Hank muttered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. The number was unfamiliar. Hello? Is this Hank Miller? A woman's voice asked. She sounded nervous. Yes, who's this? My name is Eleanor Caldwell. I'm a funeral director in Maine. She paused. This is going to sound strange, but have you been experiencing anything unusual lately? In your funeral home? Hank's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of unusual? I need to know I'm not crazy, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Things moving on their own. Voices when no one's there, feeling like you're being watched. Hank's mouth went dry. He hadn't experienced exactly those things, but the fact that another funeral director was reaching out about strange occurrences couldn't be a coincidence. How did you get my number? He asked, from an online forum for funeral directors. You posted last week asking if anyone had noticed patterns in unexplained deaths recently. Most people thought you were being dramatic, but she took a deep breath. I think we might be experiencing parts of the same thing. 30 minutes later, Hank had heard Eleanor's story about Gilbert Walsh and his strange funeral arrangements. It seemed fantastical, whispers from nowhere, objects moving on their own, a mysterious letter about bargains with creatures from the deep. Under normal circumstances, he might have written her off as stressed or overworked. But these weren't normal circumstances. I've been collecting cases, Hank told her. Deaths that don't quite add up. There's something bigger happening here. Do you think they're connected? Gilbert's? Whatever they were? And your suspicious deaths? I don't know, but I think we need to find out. That night, Hank dreamed of standing in a vast library. Instead of books, the shelves held small bottles, each containing what looked like swirling smoke. A figure moved between the shelves, its face obscured in shadow. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The collectors are being collected, it said. The watchers watched. The cycle continues. Hank woke with a start, the dream still vivid in his mind. He grabbed his phone and typed out a message to Eleanor. We need to find more people like us. Over the next week, Hank and Eleanor spoke daily, sharing research and theories. Eleanor had begun looking into Gilbert Walsh's past, discovering that before becoming a reclusive artist, he had briefly worked as a coroner's assistant in his youth. Another connection to death. Through the funeral directors forum, they found 3 more professionals who had experienced strange occurrences. Unexplained noises, missing items, unusual marks on bodies that disappeared before anyone else could verify them. None had stories quite as dramatic as Eleanor's, but all had noticed something wrong in the months since spring began. One of them, a funeral director from Millfield named Roy Washington, was initially reluctant to share details, but after several conversations, he finally opened up about Harold Fletcher and the notebooks predicting deaths. This is bigger than any of us realized, Eleanor said during one of their group calls. We're all seeing pieces of something larger. But what? Asked Roy. What connects an artist who made some kind of deal with sea creatures, a man who could predict deaths, and whatever happened with Hank's case? Hank had been quiet, piecing together the fragments of information everyone had shared. Death itself, he said finally. We all work with the dead. We all stand at the threshold between life and death every day. What if that threshold isn't as solid as we think? You mean like ghosts? Roy's wife Diane asked, skepticism clear in her voice. Not exactly, Hank said slowly. More like, what if death isn't just a moment but a force? Something conscious with rules and patterns we don't understand? And somehow we've all stumbled into awareness of it, Eleanor added, the realization dawning in her voice. The group fell silent, considering the implications. There's someone else we need to talk to, Roy said after a moment. Vivian Fletcher. She knew more about her father's notebooks than she told us. She might understand more about what's happening. Can you find her? Hank asked. I've been trying. She disappeared after taking her father's notebook, but she left a trail. Credit card purchases show she went to Lakeside next, then to a small town called Pine Hollow. Pine Hollow, Eleanor interrupted. That's where Gilbert Walsh lived before moving to the coast. I found that in my research. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. They agreed that Hank, being the most mobile of the group with no current clients, would drive to Pine Hollow to look for Vivian Fletcher and any connections to Gilbert Walsh. Pine Hollow turned out to be a town of barely 2,000 people, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest. As Hank drove down the main street, he was struck by how ordinary it looked. A small grocery store, a diner, a hardware shop, and various other businesses typical of rural America. Nothing to suggest it was a nexus of supernatural events. He checked into the only motel in town, a modest place with a flickering vacancy sign. The elderly man at the reception desk perked up at the sight of a visitor. Not many travelers this time of year, he commented as he handed over a key. What brings you to Pine Hollow? Research, Hank replied vaguely. I'm looking into local history. The man's eyes lit up. Well, you should talk to Mrs. Winters at the library then. Knows everything about this town going back 100 years. The Pine Hollow Library was a small brick building with large windows and a reading room that smelled pleasantly of old books. Mrs. Winters, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s, was exactly the kind of local historian Hank had hoped to find. Gilbert Walsh? She repeated when Hank asked. Haven't heard that name in years. Strange man. Talented artist, though. His family lived here for generations before him. Do you know why he left? Hank asked. Mrs. Winters' expression turned guarded. There was some trouble. This would have been, 30 years ago now, right after the cemetery incident. Cemetery incident? Mrs. Winters glanced around as if checking who might be listening, though they were alone in the reading room. Several graves were disturbed. Nothing stolen, mind you, just opened, like someone was looking for something. Gilbert was questioned because he'd been seen there at odd hours, but nothing was ever proven. Was Harold Fletcher from this area too? Hank asked, trying to find the connection. Mrs. Winters frowned. Fletcher doesn't ring a bell, but if you're interested in local history, you should look through our archives. We've got town records going back to the founding. The archives were kept in a climate-controlled room in the basement. Mrs. Winters showed Hank the filing system and left him to his research. He started with property records, looking for any mention of Gilbert Walsh or Harold Fletcher. 3 hours later, his eyes burning from reading faded documents, Hank found what he was looking for, a property deed from 1897 for a house on the outskirts of town. The owner was listed as Fletcher Walsh Family Trust. They were related. Hank called Roy immediately. Fletcher and Walsh were from the same family. They're connected by blood. That can't be a coincidence, Roy replied. And there's more. Diane found another funeral director online who's been experiencing strange things. A woman in Arizona who had a case similar to yours where she noticed signs of foul play that everyone else missed. We need to talk to her, Hank said, and I need to find this Fletcher Walsh house. The house turned out to be abandoned, a Victorian structure standing alone at the end of a winding road. Paint peeled from the clapboards and vines crawled up the porch columns. A no trespassing sign hung crookedly on the rusted gate. Hank sat in his car staring at the house and debating his next move. Breaking in would be illegal, but he'd come too far to turn back now. As he considered his options, a car pulled up behind him, a rental based on the sticker in the window. A woman stepped out, her red hair pulled back in a bun. "You must be Hank Miller," she said. "Roy Washington told me you'd be here." "Vivian Fletcher," Hank replied, recognizing her from Roy's description. She nodded, then turned to look at the house. "So this is where it all started. The family home. You knew about this place?" "Not until recently. My father never talked about his past. After I took his notebook, I started researching, trying to understand what was happening to him." "To me? What do you mean happening to you?" Vivian's expression was grim. "I've started seeing them too. The death dates, just like my father." Inside the abandoned house, dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights. The furniture was draped with yellowed sheets, the wallpaper peeling in long strips. It smelled of mildew and decay. "What are we looking for?" Hank asked. "I don't know exactly," Vivian admitted. "Something that explains why my father could see when people would die. Why this Gilbert Walsh made deals with sea creatures. Why you can see murders that others miss." They moved through the rooms methodically, checking for anything unusual. In what must have been a study, they found bookshelves still lined with ancient volumes. Medical texts, philosophical treatises on death and the afterlife, obscure religious texts. The Fletcher Walsh family were death scholars, Vivian murmured, running her finger along the spines. Generation after generation, studying what happens when we die. In the basement, they found something more disturbing. A room set up like an old-fashioned laboratory, with shelves of bottles containing substances Hank couldn't identify. A large stone table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained dark. "I think they were conducting experiments," Hank said quietly. "On what?" Vivian asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "On death itself." That night, Hank, Vivian, Eleanor, Roy, and Diane held an emergency video call, along with the funeral directors from Arizona and Texas who had recently joined their group. They shared what they'd found at the Fletcher Walsh house: books documenting experiments going back to the 1870s, journals describing attempts to pierce the veil between life and death. "They were trying to understand what happens after we die," Hank explained. "And in the process, they somehow thinned the barrier, made it possible for some people to sense things they shouldn't." "Like death dates," said Roy. "Or sea creatures that collect souls," added Eleanor. "Or signs of murder that others miss," Vivian said. Looking at Hank, "But why us?" asked the funeral director from Arizona. "Why are we the ones experiencing these things?" "Because we work with the dead," Eleanor said simply. "We stand at that threshold every day, and now that threshold is getting thinner for everyone." "The experiments never stopped," Vivian added quietly. "My father continued them. I think Gilbert Walsh did too, in his own way, and now whatever they were studying is starting to notice us back." The implications hung heavy in the digital silence that followed. Each of them had seen behind a curtain that most people never knew existed. Each had glimpsed something of the true nature of death, not as a simple ending, but as something more complex, more aware, more terrifying than any of them had imagined. "What do we do now?" Diane finally asked. "We keep documenting," Hank said firmly. "We share what we know with each other, and we watch for patterns. If death is changing or if our perception of it is, we need to understand how and why. And we need to be careful," Eleanor added, touching the driftwood charm around her neck. "Whatever's out there, it knows we're watching now." As they ended the call, Hank looked out his motel window at the dark streets of Pine Hollow. Somewhere in this quiet town, a family had begun unraveling secrets that were never meant to be discovered. Now he and the others were caught in the consequences, standing at a threshold that was becoming increasingly unstable. He thought of Mr. Reynolds, of Gilbert Walsh, of Harold Fletcher, all connected to a force they barely understood. The boundary between life and death had never been as solid as most people believed. And now Hank knew that sometimes, if you stood at that boundary long enough, something on the other side might start looking back. Rain pounded against the windows of the small conference room in the Pinewood Inn. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day had finally broken, sheets of water cascading down as thunder rumbled overhead. Inside, 6 people sat around a table covered with papers, books, and laptops, funeral directors from different parts of the country, drawn together by experiences that defied explanation. Hank stood at a makeshift bulletin board where they'd pinned photos, news clippings, and handwritten notes. Red string connected related items, creating a web of connections that looked like something from a detective show. But this was no TV drama, this was their reality. So let's go through what we know for sure, he said, capping a marker. The Fletcher Walsh family has been studying death for generations, conducting experiments to understand what happens after we die. Those experiments weaken something, Eleanor added, touching the driftwood charm around her neck. A boundary between life and death. And now we're all experiencing effects of that weakening, said Roy, his hand resting protectively on Diane's shoulder. Each in different ways. The funeral director from Arizona, a sturdy woman in her 50s named Lou, tapped her fingers on the table. I can see causes of death that don't show up in autopsies, things that shouldn't be possible. I hear the voices of the recently deceased, admitted the director from Texas, a soft-spoken man called Pete. Not all of them, just some, telling me things they never got to say in life. Vivian Fletcher, who had joined their group reluctantly, sat slightly apart from the others. And I've inherited my father's curse, seeing the dates people will die. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows in sheets. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The question is, Diane said, breaking the tense silence, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we fix things? Hank shook his head. I'm not sure we can fix anything, but we need to understand what's happening. These experiences we're having, they're not random. They're connected to our work, to our proximity to death. Eleanor opened an old leather-bound book they'd found in the Fletcher Walsh house. According to these records, the family believed death wasn't just a state of being, but an entity of sorts. Not a person or a god, but a force with awareness. That sounds crazy, Lou said, but her tone lacked conviction. Crazier than seeing death causes that medical examiners can't find? Pete asked gently. Crazier than hearing the voices of the dead? Lou conceded the point with a grimace. The family wrote about thinning the veil, Eleanor continued. They believed there was a barrier between life and death that could be made more permeable. They performed rituals, experiments, some of them quite dark. And they succeeded, Vivian said quietly. My father wrote about it in his earliest notebooks. He said once you glimpse what's beyond the veil, it can see you too. A particularly loud crack of thunder made them all jump. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness except for the glow of their laptop screens. Perfect timing, Roy muttered. Someone found a flashlight and its beam swept across the room, catching their tense faces in its glow. I think, Hank said slowly, we need to consider the possibility that we were brought together for a reason. Not by chance, but by something that wants us to understand what's happening. Or by something that wants us to finish what the Fletcher Walsh family started, Pete suggested. They sat in the dim light, the rain creating a constant backdrop of white noise. Each person lost in their own thoughts, considering the impossible things they'd witnessed and what it all meant. I've been having dreams, Eleanor finally said. About an endless library with bottles containing what looks like smoke. Is anyone else experiencing something similar? The others exchanged glances. Mine is a field of white flowers that turn black when I touch them, Lou admitted. A staircase that goes down forever, said Pete. I can hear whispers from the bottom, but I can never reach it. A clock with hands that spin backward, Roy added, while Diane nodded. An ocean at night, Vivian said, with lights moving beneath the surface. Hank was the last to speak. Mine is a hallway of doors. Behind each one is a person at the moment of their death. They all turn and look at me at the same time. They fell silent again, the implications of their shared dreamscapes hanging in the air between them. Death is reaching out to us, Eleanor whispered, using our subconscious minds to communicate. But what does it want? Diane asked before anyone could answer. All their phones chimed simultaneously. The same text message appeared on each screen, sent from an unknown number. The threshold thins. The watchers become the bridge. The lights came back on suddenly, making them all blink in the brightness. Outside, the storm continued unabated. Well, that was properly creepy, Lou said, trying for humor but falling short. I think it's an answer to your question, Hank said to Diane. What it wants is for us to be aware, To understand what's happening, but why? Roy pressed. What's the point? Eleanor closed the old book gently. Maybe because we're the ones who stand at the threshold every day. We prepare the dead, comfort the living, bridge the gap between the two states. We're already halfway to understanding what the Fletcher Walsh family spent generations trying to grasp. So what now? Pete asked. Do we just keep experiencing these things? Keep having weird dreams and seeing death omens? Vivian, who had been quiet for some time, finally spoke up. I think we each need to make a choice. We can try to ignore it, pretend none of this is happening, or we can accept that we've seen behind the curtain and find a way to use that knowledge. Use it how? Lou asked. To help people, Hank said simply. Isn't that what we all do anyway? Help people navigate the worst moments of their lives? Now we just have a deeper understanding of what they're going through. The group dispersed shortly after midnight, each returning to their rooms to pack for their journeys home the next day. They had exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch, to share any new experiences or insights. None of them would ever see the world the same way again. 6 months later, on a crisp fall afternoon, Hank stood beside a grave as a family said their final goodbyes to their elderly mother. The service was simple but moving, exactly what the deceased had wanted. As the mourners placed flowers on the casket, Hank noticed something he would have missed before. A slight shimmer in the air above the grave, like heat rising from hot pavement. He'd learned not to fear these moments. Since the meeting in Pinewood, he had come to recognize the signs, to understand that death wasn't just an ending but a transition. He couldn't see beyond the veil completely, but he knew now that it was thinner than most people realized. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Eleanor, checking in as she did every few weeks. They all stayed connected now, sharing their continuing experiences through a private online forum. Their little group had grown to include a dozen funeral directors across the country, all of whom had begun to notice things others couldn't see. Hank had taken his new awareness and channeled it into advocacy work, pushing for more thorough death investigations in cases where he sensed something wasn't right. He'd helped solve 3 suspicious deaths in the past 6 months, working quietly with a detective who didn't ask too many questions about Hank's hunches. Eleanor had embraced a more spiritual approach to her work, incorporating elements from various traditions that honored the transition between worlds. Her clients found comfort in her rituals, even if they didn't fully understand their significance. Roy and Diane had started documenting unexplained phenomena associated with death, creating a record for future funeral directors who might find themselves experiencing similar things. Their collection of accounts stretched back through centuries, gathered from old journals, letters, and personal testimonies. Lou had begun offering special services for families who felt their loved ones had unfinished business, helping them create closure that acknowledged the continued presence of those who had passed. Pete used his ability to hear the final messages of the dead to provide comfort to grieving families, delivering words of love and forgiveness that had been left unsaid in life. And Vivian, perhaps most surprisingly, had taken over her father's funeral home, using her inherited ability not to predict deaths, but to provide extra care to those whose time was approaching. She never revealed how she knew, but families often remarked on her uncanny timing and compassion. They had all found ways to use their glimpses beyond the veil to bring more understanding and peace to those dealing with death. The threshold remained mysterious but no longer frightening. As the last mourners left the cemetery, Hank remained behind for a moment, watching the shimmer above the grave slowly fade. He didn't have all the answers about what waited beyond life. The Fletcher Walsh experiments had opened a door that could never fully close again, revealing that death was not an end but a continuation, not a wall, but a permeable membrane.